So I did finally get around to do a follow-up video relating anarchism and its ideology. Now, we're still gonna be concerned with theory in this video, as well as making a historical commentary, if you will, on a key historical anarchist figure. But I might make a video in the future as well, relating more practices within anarchism, historical manifestations, and current approaches. Now, since it's a rather long video, let's begin by looking at an overview of what we will cover in this video. We will start by giving an overview of really a key figure which we didn't cover in terms of an anarchist thinker, namely that of Bakunin, and furthermore we will look at some critiques of religion which he had, as well as his contribution of federalism. We will also then move on to looking at anarchism and the field of criminology and looking at some approaches which have been developed from anarchists. This will relate some rather radical ideas in terms of how to deal with crime and punishment from an anarchist perspective. We will then move on to cover feminism from an anarchist viewpoint, which has really been a major influence on a lot of movements within women's liberation, both from the 70s as well as earlier time periods, and it can be seen as a major contribution from the perspective of anarchism. Lastly, we will look at some critiques of anarchism taken as a whole, before giving a brief summary in the end of what we have covered. Now, to get some sort of fresh start, let's begin by giving the definition, which I also gave in the previous video, of that of anarchism. We will give a definition of anarchism as a political theory which concerns itself with the achievement of a classless, stateless society, free from all forms of hierarchical control, where its citizenry are free to cooperate. Now, we can begin by discussing the contributions of Bakunin to anarchist theory, who certainly takes prominence in anarchist history, but where I would at the same time claim that his importance during his life was perhaps even more tied with the extraordinary life that he lived, along with his active participation within the ideological movement. This includes being expelled from France, imprisonment, been given a death sentence in absentia in Russia, and lastly escaping exile in Siberia under naturally harsh conditions. Thus, there are certainly other anarchists who made larger theoretical contributions, such as those I covered in the previous video, where we might therefore place Bakunin as someone who gained reputation primarily as an activist, rather than that as a theoretician. I must admit that from my own readings of him, I concur with this assessment, where I might add that I feel that he lacks also an ability in terms of putting forth philosophical arguments, such as when discussing distinctions between idealism and materialism in his most famous work, God and the State, to name one example, along with his tendency to give sentimentalist appeals when discussing human emancipation. This does not mean, however, that one should not read him, as there are certainly in existence many valuable inputs, most dominantly in his espousal of the position known as federalism, which we will discuss shortly, as well as his critique of religion, which can be seen alongside other famous opponents of religion in the last half of the 19th century, such as Darwin, Huxley, Nietzsche, and Marx himself. For Bakunin, then, there was a strong critique to be had of religion, especially in regards to institutional religion, which he argued instilled a construction of illegitimate power structures, which through its instillment of religious dogma meant that positions were to be accepted on blind faith alone, where both obedience and submission to higher powers were seen as virtues. This also meant the continuation as well as support for structural economic inequalities, as religion served a power function within society, a function which aligned itself with the ruling elites. It's important to realize here, of course, that Bakunin was writing from a context of 19th century European life, in which the church in his time was afforded a lot more leeway in terms of blind authority and submission to church doctrines, which has been significantly lessened for the most part in current practices. Another critique he espoused was in terms of the illusion of religion itself, where humankind was put under an illusion, or to use Marx's phrase, an opium for the people, where exploitations of the ruling classes were routinely justified, such as claiming monarchs, religious leaders, and other rulers to be given a mandate by God himself, in order to in turn elevate these people above the ground of ordinary citizens. Could one not then interpret this opium, which in itself was a common pain reliever at the time, as serving as a metaphor of religion's functions as that of a coping mechanism? A mechanism which works to legitimize existing power balances, while at the same time provides a temporal remedy in the form of solace and forgiveness to its working class adherents. For Bakunin, nature could be perfectly and sufficiently be described by reality itself, thus there was no need to invoke deities or other religious phenomena in order to provide an explanans. We should, however, be careful here in pointing out that while Bakunin was an atheist and materialist, he obviously believed in the importance of non-material things, such as political freedom, non-hierarchical structures, as well as social freedom. He held ideas which developed over time, where some of his ideas even borrowed inspiration from seemingly opposing viewpoints, such as idealism, in the sense of his materialistic naturalism, drawing heavily from Hegelian notions, and spirituality in terms of non-traditional ways, replacing the role of the divine in terms of a creative force, which he saw as inherent in all of humanity. We might therefore conclude this section by placing Bakunin in the camp of atheism, in the sense of critiquing religion along the lines of exerting unjustified hierarchical structures, which envelops religious as well as spiritual institutions and practices, which furthermore entailed, according to him, a crushing force against notions of individual freedom. For Bakunin, God was at such great odds with the development of human freedom and emancipation that he attributed the famous quote of, "If God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him." Bakunin can here be seen therefore as adopting the consensus position within anarchism of the rejection of religion under the banner of atheism. On inspection, this might be seen as rather accordant with the philosophy of anarchism, as the ideology occupies itself with societal constructions along the lines of non-hierarchical structures, voluntary cooperation, mutual aid, as well as supporting large-scale freedom from authority and a strong rejection of coercion, which also helps to explain why atheism continues to be widely supported within the ideology. That is not to say, however, that there have not been in existence proponents of religion within anarchist circles. Most famously seen, I would say, with the work of the famous Russian novelist of Leo Tolstoy. In the briefest of terms, Tolstoy proposed a form of anarchism known as Christian anarchism, drawing inspiration from the life of Jesus himself, where he emphasized the role of non-violence in the former sermons, which he extended to a critique of oppressive institutions, which he took to encompass the state, as well as adhering to the position of pacifism. There was obviously an influence which must have inspired him from the Bible, in terms of moral dualism, along with notions of the existence of an objective morality, along with the prescriptions of leading a simple ascetic life, which serve in many forms as the basis of the teachings of Jesus. We might also here include to the list the possibility of forgiveness for past transgressions, which again can be seen as enabling a powerful transformative experience, which is tied with the achievement of both emotional as well as spiritual freedom. Thus, there does exist a pedigree of Christian anarchism within the movement, but certainly what has been most historically weighted among anarchists is the position taking of sharing an opposition regarding religion along the lines of religion's institutional authority, non-justified dogmas, and prescriptions for living one's own private life, as well as other atheistic arguments for both the non-existence of deities, as well as a general opposition of religion taken as a whole. To end off the section on Bakunin, we should mention here what may be seen as his most famous contribution to anarchist theory, namely that of federalism, of which he can be regarded as one of its earliest proponents, as well as greatest contributors. We should also remark for clarity here that when we are talking about federalism in the context of anarchism, We are not talking about the popular usage in terms of organizing states, which are often taken to mean vesting more power to states in terms of decision making. This distinction is nicely summarized by the following quote. Though anarchists use federalism to refer to a means of organizing society in a manner that is totally bottom-up, it has a wider, more common meaning among mainstream ideologues to refer to a system of organizing states. In this mainline understanding, federalism means the devolution of the majority of the state's powers to more local units. For instance, the state government of New South Wales is responsible for policing, healthcare, transport, education, and other functions within the territory of New South Wales, not the federal government. It sets its own laws provided they do not conflict with the Constitution, and other functions like rubbish collection and park management are conceived of as local and are delegated out accordingly to municipal councils. According to the view of federalism in the anarchist sense, a society should be structured along the lines of a bottom-up approach, where constituent groups are formed based upon both autonomy and the right of self-determination. Keeping in the lines of Bakunin, he stressed the importance of self-governing communities, along with voluntary organizations, where in theory he was not opposed to higher-order committees as well as council formations, but what was important here structurally was that these forms of higher-order structures do not inherit any power in terms of directing the organization itself. For an example in relation as to how these diverse groups make informed decisions within both voluntary organization and self-governing committees. Rather, these higher-order structures are composed of members whose mandates may be revoked in strict instantaneous fashion, and whose member inclusion is based around shorter temporal periods than what is typically associated with many state leaders today. One can think of these structures then as aiding in both cooperation as well as coordination between groups, where the organizations themselves form the localized units in which decisions are made within the confines of a structure agreed upon by the same organizations. In totality, federalism may be seen in opposition to the type of central rule seen in many alternative ideologies spanning from authoritative socialism in one end and neoliberalism on the other end, where features such as central units issuing orders in top-down fashion are the norm both in workers' organizations as well as in traditional political parties. The philosophy of federalism then ties in directly with that of the acquisition of power, where instead of power being concentrated in the hands of a few individuals, Bakunin, along with federalism, sought to disperse power among various decentralized autonomous units. Obviously then, Bakunin can be seen as a major contributor of federalism, emphasizing a stateless rule, along with the formations of federations, which works towards a decentralized stateless society within non-hierarchical structures for society taken as a whole. Note that the condition we referenced here in terms of a stateless society can be for Bakunin defended along the lines of a state formation not being compatible with the freedom of wage earners, or to use the overused term proletariat, in which under these conditions of a state it would not be possible to construct an international fraternal unions of peoples, due to its both authoritarian bent, which is kept through both coercive and violent means, as well as the state embodying a hierarchical structure. We will next tackle the issue of the philosophy of criminology within anarchism, which takes many arguments and forms, but perhaps a shared commonality may be stated in terms of the rejection of state authority, as well as inhabiting a critical stance towards traditional legal systems currently in practice. We will begin by examining some re-evaluations in terms of criminal justice, which as it stands is justified along the lines of not just providing a satisfactory implementation of retribution and rehabilitation, but there is very often a masked, even grander claim about the underlying justifications of capitalism and the state, which makes the criminal justice system possible, as providing with what they claim to be a natural representation of human nature. Given how little we know about human nature, this certainly strikes me as a rather grand claim, which needs to be justified, especially when we consider the fact that humanity has existed without a state for the majority of its history. In any case, the anarchist critique, which is levied against the penal system as it stands, concerns itself with the normalization and expansion of an extremely stratified, perpetuated inequality, which is directed from the hands of state capitalism, and where marginalized groups, peoples with disabilities, as well as other lower ranks of the social ladder, are disproportionately at the suffering end of the criminalization process. Part of the role of state capitalism, then, is to facilitate, exploit, and criminalize the stratified, impoverished conditions which have been generated by the same system through its ideology. As anarchists seek to reject both the privatization of wealth, as well as what they claim to be an authoritarian distribution of collective wealth by state capitalism, what is opted for in this ideological vision is a social organization along the lines of freely associating individuals through direct forms of democratic organizations, as well as supporting direct action through its means of enacting both social and political change through direct intervention. If we apply these principles to criminology, anarchists naturally place a strong emphasis on the riddance of private property, seeing how in especially developed nations, property-related crimes, such as burglary, theft, and vandalism, make up a large portion of crimes committed. An argument can be made connecting these types of practices to peoples who have been excluded from the means of private production, where systemic inequality acts as a major driving force for the perpetuation of the crimes in question. On the other side of the spectrum, there exist the owners of the means of production themselves, where a subset commit countless serious white-collar crimes, such as fraud, embezzlement, and insider trading. The overall point here being that both for the crimes found at the lower ends of the economic ladder, as well as crimes pertaining to the very rich, can be described as well as understood within a framework of capitalist economics. For example, some explanatory factors pertaining to poverty-influenced crimes can be characterized by a lack of opportunity, as well as a general lack of the same access as found in higher earning brackets. A more full remuneration from the workplace, as well as a voice to significantly affect management, are stripped away, as an, to quote, unquestioned assumption of private property is maintained as the norm within society. At the other end of the spectrum, the crimes of the very wealthy are a product of greed, as well as power expansions, where a monotonous, endless pursuit of wealth becomes an instilled mode of conduct within capitalism, where moral issues as well as social issues are often tossed aside as externalities for the insular focus of maximizing profit. As anarchists argue in both cases in terms of underlying injustices of private property and ownership, which are again conventionally defended among the established political philosophy in terms of the justice system, it is not then surprising that much of modern criminology, which aims at legitimizing these structures within a capitalistic framework, are heavily critiqued. To quote, "The majority of criminological theory and criminal justice policy is constructed to legitimize, validate, and perpetuate the injustices of private property and ownership. Anarchists can then be seen to reject the concept of private property because the earth and accompanying resources and wealth are the collective inheritance of all human and non-human life." So what then do anarchists propose as an alternative? We may ask if it's even possible to construct a democratically decided civic order along anarchist principles. Anarchists certainly think so, where we will in this section look at some more concrete alternative theories within a criminology framework which have been proposed historically by anarchists from around the world. Stemming from a positive regards to human autonomy, as well as human beings' ability to both organize and develop themselves, many anarchists endorse a position of abolitionism when it comes to prisons and other punitive measures. This position, which obviously will be met with a lot of public opposition in terms of discourse, seeks to abolish prisons when possible, as well as seeking to re-image the current justice system. Some of this re-imaging will take the form of widening the scope of addressing systemic inequalities, which affects the marginalized sector most of all, getting rid of oppressive structures such as those based around non-justified hierarchical relationships, as well as getting rid of overt power imbalances as seen through the misuse and misplacement of power through a competitive capitalistic framework. A major theme of the non-justified use of power can be seen through an advocacy for community-based decision-making, which effectively localizes power around a more horizontal power distribution, where local conflicts and crimes committed can be addressed according to solutions made through a decision-making apparatus, where community members actively partake through direct democratic means. The outcome of this process, according to anarchists, is the allowance of a more nuanced as well as context-specific response to dealing with these issues, which, since these transgressions affect the local community the most, the community should thus also have the greatest say in the response and implementation of justice to these transgressions. In this manner, the solutions put in place will have been collectively shaped by the community, where in addition we might imagine a general framework of laws, principles, or agreements that might resemble more constitutional ideas, without the institutional framework of the state being put into place. This might take the form of federations among autonomous communities, for instance, but here it is important to note that any form of principles which effectively serve as guidelines will have to be voluntarily agreed upon, and following in the tradition of scientific theories, these implementations will have to be tentative and open to revision for the public. Thus, an important component taking to encompass all justice systems under anarchism would aim to be decentralized to ensure local administration, as well as ensuring diverse approaches to justice, which would be open to both amendments and revisions following in the tradition of direct democracy. One should also point out here that anarchism being a diverse ideology, it's guaranteed that some of its proponents will reject the idea of anything this fixed being put into place, as it falls too close to that of having a constitution, which according to them should be rejected. In addition to community-based decision-making, a closely related idea would be that of mutual aid and support networks. Here, these implementations serve as providing solutions without resorting to punitive measures, where upholding a strong sense of solidarity remains a key component. This might be fitting when dealing with a majority of crimes, which are non-violent, where we might imagine solutions from mutual aid coming in the form of community-based approaches, such as the creation of supportive environments which help in the form of prevention. This might also include providing additional resources, mental health support, as well as assistance to those in need. An additional important factor here would be constructing a strong sense of structure in communities in terms of rehabilitation, where resources need to be put aside for programs such as education, job training, professional counseling, extended healthcare, as well as other support programs. The goal of this additional framework, in many ways structured in place, is to reduce the likelihood of crimes which stem from factors such as a lack of resources, desperation, mental health issues, or a lack of emotional support structures. Lastly, we might touch upon the idea of restorative justice in relation to criminology, which is weighted heavily among anarchists. In opposition to what is commonly practiced in the status quo of crime response, anarchists place a much greater emphasis on effective communities coming together in response to crime events taking place. Solidarity being a key component here, it is assumed that communities should wish to engage directly with harms as they unfold, where measures such as creating dialogue between victims and their offenders along with the community is deemed to be of importance, as it facilitates personal growth, as well as it seeks to strengthen the communal aspects of society. In regards to prisons, as I mentioned earlier, anarchists have typically opted for a position of abolitionism altogether when it comes to prisons, where various agreements have been made, ranging from arguing that the harsh, primal, punitive nature of prisons make them unappealing, to arguing that prisons fail to rehabilitate, which is very often the prime reason given in its favor. Anarchists argue further that the failure to rehabilitate creates more systemic problems, as what is set in motion takes the form of a cycle of recidivism, where new, often more serious crimes are committed after inmates are released from the penal system. Given the non-hierarchical inheritance of its ideology, many anarchists also argue that the prison system apparatus seeks to abuse authority in a severe fashion, where authorities inhabit much too great power over their inmates, which is again tied to abuses as well as frequent violations of human rights. In terms of replacing the prison system, anarchists have traditionally placed a greater emphasis on community-based solutions, including those we previously discussed, such as education, prevention, mental health implementations, decentralized justice systems, as well as a more systemic approach to ensure transformative justice within communities. In addition, some anarchists have argued for the creation of mediation and conflict resolution centers, where one would train mediators, therapists, and other professionals to deal with those parties involved in conflicts in order to deal with disputes of a criminal nature. Ideally, if conflicts are resolved through mediation, then it may also have a saving effect on society at large, as the cases may not move further to the court system. This then has the ability to deal with criminal cases in an orderly, cost-saving, and efficient manner if parties are willing to partake in the mediation process itself. To end this section on criminology, I do want to make a brief comment in regards to anarchism and human nature, as I assume for many the first reactions to especially of the abolishment of prisons will seem both radical and idealized when it comes to our reflections upon criminal behavior. It should be noted that anarchism does not adopt the scientifically erroneous position of human beings being infinitely flexible or having infinite plasticity, where one enters into the world with few to any impressions and ultimately are molded by society in complete fashion. What little we know of human nature at present, we can at the very least state that Homo sapiens are in possession of the ability to learn and to adapt to dynamic surroundings, as well as having the capacity to make autonomous decisions, although of varying ability. There is a nice quote by Chomsky, reiterating this point of rejecting a tabula rasa of the human mind, where he states that, "I don't think it's possible to give a rational account of the concept of alienated labor on the assumption that human nature is nothing but a historical product, nor is it possible to produce anything like a moral justification for the commitment to some kind of social change, except on the basis of assumptions about human nature and how modifications in the structure of society will be better to conform to some of the fundamental needs that are part of our essential nature." I have also linked a section of the Anarchist FAQ dealing with human nature, which is quite good if you are interested in a further discussion upon human nature in relation with anarchism. We will next tackle the topic of feminism in relation to anarchism, which historically speaking has made quite progressive assertions in terms of women's rights, although disappointingly there have also been upheld quite misogynistic views from very prominent anarchists, including figures such as Proudhon. However, by large, anarchism has in general made both major contributions to the developments of feminism, as well as critiquing the treatment of women in society, going all the way back to the French Revolution with groups such as the ultra-radicals known as the Anarchistes, whose membership included that of Jean-François Vallée, a fierce revolutionary who both appointed women as speakers as well as helped them to mobilize during the revolution. This early position of proto-feminism was further espoused by other female members of the Anarchistes, such as Claire Lacombe and Pauline Léon, who both advocated for women's rights, as well as the latter even advocating for the formation of a female militia and affording full citizenship to women, a highly radical idea at the time. This streak of feminism also carried over into the anarchism of the 19th century, where, for instance, the previously mentioned anarchist thinker of Bakunin remarked that even the best educated, talented, intelligent woman is inferior to even the most ignorant man. It would be amiss here to not as well mention the American female anarchist thinker of Emma Goldman, who in addition to advocating for revolutionary trade unions, also held a pro-position in terms of women's rights in rejecting a patriarchal male construction of arrangements in her own time frame, as well as seeking equality between men and women. She critiqued capitalism for its propensity of reducing women's entrance into the labor force, and when women were included, it was only in terms of cheap labor. Capitalism was also a factor in contributing to promote both objectification as well as sexualization of women through the commodification of women's bodies, consumerism, as well as reinforcing patriarchal norms, which are relayed falsely under the guise of a natural female human nature, or an innate natural disposition, if you will. The banner of feminism would continue into the 20th century, along with a general advocacy for extended social justice in differing domains. Starting at the very tail end of the 19th century, a system of analysis combining principles of anarchism with that of feminism emerged, with early female figures such as Teresa Manet and Teresa Claramunt, which served as among the very first proponents for what is now known as anarcho-feminism. Anarcho-feminism can be easily thought of as a subset of anarchism, or as forming a branch where the intersection of anarchism with that of feminism crosses paths. This can be confusing when viewing the many flags of anarchism which make up different positions, which are especially advocated for. But it is very often the case that several branches of anarchism are both compatible with one another, such that one may adopt several positions, and there usually does not arise contradictions when subscribing to different branches, unless we are talking about more incompatible views of traditional anarchism, such as anarcho-capitalism or national anarchism, for instance. Certainly, with anarcho-feminism in regards to anarchism, as the latter opposes coercive relationships in a very broad sense, as well as hierarchical power formations, the ideology may be taken to trivially align itself with that of feminism, as it seems to me. We may here describe anarcho-feminism further as advocating for the integration of denouncing patriarchy, which in turn positions men in roles of dominance and privilege, with that of class conflict, which seeks to identify the economic stratification which exists among differing social classes. Early feminist proponents, such as the Chinese anarchist He Jin-sen, emphasized the subjugation of women in her own time, taking on Confucian practices which were not in accordance with feminist teachings, as well as stressing the importance of female autonomy, which extended to women being able to make free choices, where one should keep in mind the biases which arise in society as a consequence of, according to her view, of gender being inextricably linked with that of class structure. She argued for the right of separation, as well as some rather radical, even in this age, conceptions of the raising of children. To quote, "The woman's revolution is but one aspect of the social revolution. After the social revolution is accomplished after birth, all children would be raised in public childcare facilities. Accordingly, mothers would no longer have to raise their children by themselves. Once relieved of this task, women would assume responsibilities equal to men's." Later into the 20th century, anarcho-feminism served part in women's movements of the 1970s, where due to the long radical history of the movement, there were both theoretical contributions to be made, as well as anarcho-feminism serving a role in terms of what could be accomplished with regards to that of activism. Some central points here include offering direction in terms of grassroots organizing and direct action, or collective action in activism activities, along with a focus of non-hierarchical structures, emphasizing the role of both mutual aid as well as localized cooperative action, was something that both was sought after, as well as did in fact influence the women's movement in its day. As virtually all anarchists are skeptical of mainstream political institutions due to lackluster confidence in their ability to enact change, the movement has also influenced thinking along the lines of alternative community-based initiatives. Furthermore, with the questioning of traditionally ascribed female roles being topical at the time, anarchists contributed in terms of influencing discussions on gender identity, gender expression, as well as supporting women's campaigns for seeking equality in the workforce. Moving to more contemporary settings, It's important to highlight the contributions of the anarcho-feminism movement in terms of seeking to go beyond mere economic reductionism with its more insular focus upon economic discrepancies between genders, and of which has also been more traditionally associated with more orthodox forms of feminist Marxist philosophy. In contrast, anarcho-feminism has from its root development sought to tackle and challenge all forms of hierarchy, as well as oppression within society, with a large scope of interests including intersectionality, gender equality, a development of a critique of capitalism on the grounds of freedom from external domination, as well as presenting an alternative vision of a future society based around a restructuring of society through non-hierarchical relationships. That being said, there have developed more countercurrents to anarcho-feminism with the increase of popularity of competing feminist theories, such as those most prominently seen with the rise of popularity of postmodern feminist theories, at least in relation to academia, where these theories continues to get ample exposure. One might therefore make the case that anarcho-feminism is not quite as popular as it once was when we relate intellectual and academic circles. Let's conclude this section by stating that feminism within anarchism has had and continues to have a wide reach, where we note due to the increase of more progressive views over time when it comes to social politics among the youth, positions which were once held to be popular decades ago, such as a resistance to women in the workforce or participation in university, have declined in rapid fashion, which at least gives some indication as to the acceptability of more radical ideas, which have been traditionally held by a great majority of anarchists for over 100 years of history. This also gives the justification for including the topic in the video, here positioned as a central theme within anarchism, where I argued that it is one of the branches within anarchism which has had perhaps the most significant effects in terms of influencing the direction of society in practical terms, in a more radical direction, if you will, as we witness the younger generation continues to adhere, for the most part at least, to left-leaning social policies in day-to-day life. Having given somewhat of a concise introduction to the ideology of anarchism in these two videos, including some relevant theories, we will in this last section look at some critiques which can be brought against the ideology. I should state here that whether one identifies as an anarchist or not, these are considerations which should be given thoughtful examination, in my opinion, if one wants to be epistemically responsible at the very least, where I'm obviously in favor of critically examining one's own political beliefs, along with other beliefs. The first of these critiques relates possible insufficiencies in terms of organizing an effective army to defend against external threats, which should be especially considered in relation to war times, as these situations might involve a serious breakdown of life support and other logistical structures put in place in society. As anarchism in general requires more interventions or safeguards against the abuse of power, leading to an overall decentralized decision-making apparatus, these might be severely compromised to a point during war times which would make it difficult to not imagine more centralized forms of control taking its place. As an adoption of more conventional military practices would likely lead to resistance among anarchists, as it did during the Spanish Civil War, for instance, anarchists will have to propose viable options as to effectively organizing disciplinary units along horizontal lines of power distributions. There were, as it should be noted, experiments during the struggle against the Red Army during the lifetime of Ukrainian anarchist revolutionary Makhno, with his proposed self-disciplined guerrillas in terms of creating alternative military structures, but one would have to make a case for either this type or an alternative model as to ensuring somewhat of the same type of effectiveness, as well as cohesion with that of a centralized modern army from today's perspective. The challenge thus for anarchists is to make a clear proposition in terms of the organization of an alternative line of defense in terms of military based around a decentralized, non-hierarchical structuring, where most importantly during conflict times, due to destabilizing conditions, There may be severe limitations in effectively organizing militias and community defenses due to a necessity of restructuring larger groups as well as logistically following through always with direct democratic means of decision-making, where forms such as consensus decision-making may be difficult to execute. If we imagine horizontal federations being constructed along the lines of local defense units, then likewise there is likely to be a greater difficulty in organization between federations due to the logistic difficulty in creating mutual agreements and voluntary associations during times of conflict and war especially. Anarchists frequently propose rotation of roles within military positions, where one also has to account for more specialized knowledge being an issue in terms of technically demanding roles, where one should further develop a rotational system to take into account these more technical aspects. There may be problems with delegation in terms of more desirable jobs to perform, which will also relate to the next critique in terms of abuses of held positions in terms of self-management. Lastly, one should also give a proper account for how much civilian-based defense systems should take precedence in terms of conflict, where collective action is emphasized among civilians in terms of defense, where there may be problems with efficiency in terms of large-scale implementation of these techniques, which could also lead to an undesired as well as unnecessary large loss of civilian life during conflicts. The second critique I want to emphasize here, which also, by the way, relates to socialism in the most widely used historical sense by means of the social ownership of the means of production, relates to the delegation of the workforce under workers' self-management. If we consider a factory, for instance, involved with steel production, where implementations such as worker rotations are involved, then one needs to be careful in how to manage effectively, as well as democratically, between differing labor tasks. Some of these tasks, for instance, are obviously going to be more desirable than others, and may require more technical competence, which in turn requires a longer period of relearning in terms of acquiring new skills. The critique here is that people in these more desirable positions in the factory will exploit their position, so to speak, in terms of power in various ways, such as remaining in the allocated job longer than what is agreed upon in terms of job rotation, as well as exploiting authority in various other ways. For instance, they might exploit their initial advantage in competence before other workers have been properly trained to perform the same tasks in such a way that they coercively manipulate the job structuring and thus oppose the very non-hierarchical structuring which is emphasized within anarchism. It should be noted that there is some historical precedence of this taking place, for instance during the upsurge in self-management following the 2001 riots in Argentina, for instance, in which measures of real social changes were enacted, including millions of people involved in the creation of neighborhood assemblies. The example of a factory was of course here chosen arbitrarily, but the critique remains in all domains of work life under workers' self-management as to how effectively organize in regards to differing technical skills required for different positions, where especially during an initiation period of rotational shifts, people with existing competencies are likely to abuse their power in various ways. There is also additional difficulties in implementations of self-management, or even more so worker cooperatives, which inherently has a lower scope as the former emphasizes transforming the entire economic system, while many advocate for worker cooperatives functioning within a capitalistic framework under equivalent productivity standards. The problem here lies in a proper effective structuring according to non-hierarchical and localized means, when the impetus under capitalism is for both maximization of profit as well as an organizational model which is inherently anti-democratic and hierarchical according to anarchists, where workers are routinely exploited and where little is done in terms of third world starvation wages as well as other abhorrent working conditions. It may thus be hard to remain competitive in regards to competing against capitalist structures, which in turn embodies an imposing ethos based around profit maximization, which often regards both environmental issues as well as extending welfare structures for its employees as externalities, not to mention the immediate concerns of granting loans to a collective workforce, as well as coming up with venture capital. Finally, very briefly, a last critique I want to mention in regards to anarchism is that of the relations among decentralized, localized, non-hierarchical communities. For if one imagines future constructed anarchist societies, which encompass a wide range of communes, each with differing developments, as well as artistic propensities for urban planning, where we might very easily imagine there arising tensions. One of the most problematic of these would involve a potentiality of xenophobia arising, which very well may become an issue as a certain subset of people may become habituated to the norms of either their own commune or a collection of familiar communes, failing to appreciate features of diversity and plurality among communes as people become too habituated with localized structuring of their pick of communes, so to speak. Then this seems to be a salient point which needs to be addressed by anarchists. We may be reminded here of the experiments of direct democracy seen in ancient Greece, of which Athens was the most democratically developed of these, although obviously these were not directly anarchist experiments per se, where for instance women and slaves did not have the right to vote, but yet did involve a strong sense of both direct democracy as well as localized decision-making for many of its inhabitants within city-states. And yet these city-states obviously displayed strong signs of xenophobia at times to opposing neighborhood city-states, localized patriotism, racism, as well as a sense of superiority in relation to certain communes then needs to be addressed. I will point out here, however, that anarchists do not believe that a future anarchist society would abolish every singular instance of racism under their ideology, but rather that there would be a massive reduction of racism as well as other forms of authoritarian dominance stemming from the incongruency of these ideas with the ideology as well as other structured implementations proposed by anarchists to counter these currents. Alright, so that concludes the video, but it would be perhaps informative to give some quick summary of what we have discussed in this video. So I'll quickly state that we started looking at the anarchist thinker of Bakunin with his critique of religion, as well as his contribution of federalism. We then looked at criminology within an anarchist framework, which emphasized positions which include a decentralized approach to the justice system, where we have local community groups which are again weighted very heavily, community-based decision apparatus based upon direct democracy, transformative justice, where broader systemic injustices are addressed, a focus on the prevention of crime, both including education as well as other resources implemented, a strong community-based program based around supporting rehabilitation, restorative justice in terms of dealing with the aftermath of crimes, and lastly the abolishment of prisons. We also made some brief remarks regarding human nature as well as solidarity. Next, we tackled the issue of feminism, as well as making some remarks around social justice, before ending with a brief discussion on the critiques of anarchism, where we looked at essentially one may argue 4 critiques of anarchism. So yes, please like, share, and subscribe the video, and comment if you have any ideas for future videos. And until next time.